Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. Today we're going to be talking about common mistakes for new writers. So a little while ago, actually quite a while ago, I did a video where I just talked about some of my biggest newbie writer mistakes, and I will leave that in the description. In that video, I was kind of just talking about from personal experience. Today I wanted to talk about some mistakes that I just think are common in general. I think I probably made almost all of these. Not every new writer necessarily makes all of these mistakes, but I do think they're pretty common ones for new and even sometimes experienced writers. So the first mistake is the story scope being too large or the writer trying to do too much. I think new writers often get allured by complexity and equate complexity with quality. So they want to have tons of characters, tons of plot lines. They want the story to span 300 years. It's going to be a 17-book series and the scope is just massive. And sometimes stories with a massive scope can be super effective, but they don't have to be. And I think a lot of writers make the mistake of just taking on too much. And sometimes the problem is that they take on just too much for their skill or experience level, and then what happens is they get discouraged because the project is just way too much. Or they actually kind of bloat the story with a lot of unnecessary elements, and the actual core of the story ends up getting lost. Sometimes less is more. Sometimes a simple story is the most effective story. It's totally okay to write a book that has a main cast of 4 characters, just one point of view, a short timeline. That's totally okay. It's not a lesser story in any way. And for new writers, it's probably going to be more approachable. The next common mistake is just a boring introduction or a boring opening scene or opening chapter. That opening chapter, and especially opening scene, is so important for capturing a reader's attention, and a lot of writers just make the mistake of having a really boring beginning. A lot of writers think they need to establish a detailed status quo before the action can get started. And that's how we end up with a lot of first chapters that begin with a character waking up, going through their regular daily routine for like 20 pages. I think as a general rule, you want to start the story where the story gets interesting, not anywhere before. The third mistake is focusing on complicated language rather than clarity. Look, I've been here. I like myself a bit of flowery prose. I'll admit it. But it's a really common mistake to focus so much on the complexity of your language that you forget that the best language is clear and easy to understand. Good prose is easy to understand. Clarity really is the first and foremost quality of good writing. If you focus on clarity, your prose will be so much more effective than if you focus on complexity. Nothing wrong with a nice complex sentence if it's also clear. So I always encourage new writers to focus on clarity first and foremost in their writing. Clarity issues were probably my biggest area of weakness as a writer. They still are. I'm just generally quite bad at clarity, but once I realized that this was kind of my Achilles heel and everything I wrote, like, things weren't conveying as I intended because of the language, and once I started to really focus on that, that's when my writing got a lot better, when I made clarity the priority. So I definitely encourage new writers to focus as much as they can on the clarity of their prose. The next one is too much backstory or too many flashbacks. This is one that I did talk about in the video on common mistakes that I made, because this was one of my biggest mistakes. A lot of new writers get so invested in their characters' backstories that they forget about the actual story, and they overload and overcrowd the story with flashbacks. I think about an early book that I wrote, and it was like all flashback, and I have to ask myself, maybe the story was just in the past. Maybe the flashbacks were the story. It's a really common one. I think also just because flashbacks are kind of a go-to device for a lot of new writers, and a lot of new writers are scared to have exposition or are scared of info dumps, and so instead they have a lot of flashbacks. When it comes to backstory, you really just want to choose the most important parts, the most crucial parts. You don't need a flashback for every single formative moment in your character's life, otherwise we'd be here forever. So be really sparing with flashback. The next one is worrying too much about theme. I think that this is a mistake that tends to happen to writers who start writing when they're adults. I don't think this really happens to writers who start writing as children, because children or teenagers are probably not as concerned with theme. I know as like a kid writing, I wasn't thinking about theme. But I do think that a lot of adults who come into writing focus too much on theme. And it comes from this kind of academic, once you've gone through any kind of academics, whether that's just high school English or even like, you know, higher education. When you're analyzing literature in any way, there's always a big focus on theme, and that can influence new writers to think that they should be starting with theme. You probably have an issue in the story if you're focused more on theme than you are on character. Once I remember a writing professor said, if when someone says, "What's your story about?" and you answer with a theme rather than the event or the character, then there's probably a problem there. It's probably good for your story to have a theme. But stories can lose specificity, they can lose tension, if the writer is focused more on conveying the theme than just conveying an interesting story. Theme will follow. The next one is not having a clear inciting incident. This happens for novels, short stories, kind of just across the board. The inciting incident is the first major plot point, and it's basically the event that tips the dominoes. Not having an inciting incident basically means your story doesn't really have a clear start. And it can be a problem for a lot of new writers, and of course, if you've never studied writing craft, it's not necessarily an intuitive thing to know that you need to have this. But it is a really, really common mistake. When you start a new story, when you're just brainstorming a project, try to, as early as possible, identify what the inciting incident is. Trust me, it will pay off in the long run. If you want to learn more about inciting incidents, we've got an entire video on the topic. The next common new writer mistake is characters not having goals. I'll admit I sometimes still struggle with this. Sometimes I get like to the end of a short story and I'm like, what's the goal? I do think it's really common for new writers, especially if they're coming into this without having really studied craft, even though it is one of the first things you'll learn when you start studying craft. If you kind of just come into this based on your intuition, without really any background in how to write stories, it might not click that your character needs to have a clear goal, but it is also one of the fundamentals of good writing. This is also one of those things that, again, as soon as you start planning a story, as soon as you get that idea, just try to identify as soon as possible, what's my protagonist's goal, what's my antagonist's goal. A lot harder to figure this out in retrospect than it is to just do it at the beginning. And similar to that is characters not having flaws. A lot of new writers struggle with this because they get too attached to their characters. You know, they're new to creating characters and they're new to kind of the joy and the fun of creating characters, and they want their characters to be perfect and rootable. And they don't yet realize that their characters having flaws are what's going to make the character interesting. I like to think about with characters that the reader should be interested in them because of their flaws. Flaws shouldn't just be there to make them rounded. I really like to think about the flaw as like the most interesting thing about the character, to really encourage me to create really complex character flaws. But it's definitely a really common mistake for new writers. I think just because the temptation is there, you want to have a perfect character. If you're emotionally attached, it can feel hard to give them flaws. But it really is one of the most fundamental aspects to good writing. Another really common new writer mistake is not understanding how point of view works. A point of view is a really complicated tool that a lot of new writers just don't know that it's so complicated. It's one of those things where if you learned about it in high school, it gets really oversimplified. We kind of just think it's as simple as, you know, first person is I'm telling a story, a third person is, you know, she's doing this, etc., etc., and I'm never going to use second person. But it's a lot more complicated than that. Point of view is like a really complicated tool. Understand things like filtering and looking at your narrative frame and point of view shifts or head hopping. It can be a really, really complicated element of story. And I think my writing improved dramatically when I realized that point of view was actually really complicated, because back when I didn't know that, and I saw point of view as a pretty simple thing, I was making a lot of point of view related errors. So definitely for new writers, I would recommend research point of view, read up on it, research how to use it effectively, because it's a really, really important tool, and it's more important than just choosing your point of view correctly. I think a lot of writers kind of stop there. It's more than just knowing which point of view to use, it's knowing how to use point of view as a tool. Another really common mistake is redundant scenes or redundant beats within scenes. So redundant scenes, just scenes that serve no purpose. Really common for any writer at any stage. Most writers are going to have a redundant scene or two in there, probably more than two. But for new writers especially, just because you might not have built up that intuition to know what is needed and what isn't needed. But I think almost maybe even more common than redundant scenes are just redundant beats within scenes. The scene itself might be serving a purpose, but there might be a lot of fluff within that scene. It took me until way too late into my writing journey to learn that if something is uninteresting or unimportant, you can just skip it. You can just summarize it or just not include it. Anything that's not interesting or doesn't contribute anything, just don't need it. I think as a young writer and a new writer, I had this impulse to fill the reader in on anything that had happened, and it just led to a lot of fluff. I know with dialogue especially, I would know like the conversation that needed to happen, and I would spend pages getting the characters to that point because I was like, I need to have a natural way for the characters to eventually end up on that topic. I could just start the scene there. I could have just started the scene at the point where it got interesting and relevant, but no, I didn't do that. It took me way too long to realize that. Same with the story, you know, just start it where it gets interesting. And the final one is thinking that you're the exception to the rule. I think this applies to both craft topics and publishing related topics. So new writers who think, you know, like, oh, I know people say to show and not tell, but it's fine that I'm telling. Or, oh, I know they say that characters need to have goals. My character doesn't really have a goal, but it works in this case. If you're a new writer and you're trying to justify why your book doesn't follow kind of just this basic writing advice, you're probably too new to be breaking the rules. A lot of these tips are here because they just make good stories. They're tried and true, and sure, a really experienced writer might know how to bend the rules or break the rules, but a really experienced writer also probably knows that these rules are there for a reason and knows how to follow them. New writers typically have a way of justifying why they're the exception to the rule when it comes to writing craft, and it's probably not doing you any favors. I definitely did this, but I think this happens especially in regards to publishing. You know, new authors who are writing their debut novel and like, you know, it's okay that my book's 300,000 words long. I know typically agents won't sign a book that long. They want a book that's a third this length, but it's fine, I'll be the exception. Never count on yourself being the exception, especially when you're a new writer. I do think there's this trend where new writers think they're the exception to the rule, when if you're new, you're probably not. You really need experience to learn how to be the exception to the rule. But by the time you gain that experience, you realize that the rules were there for a reason and you're more inclined to follow them. I'm way more inclined to follow rules now that I'm a more experienced writer because I know that they're good. I know they're there for a reason, they exist for a reason, and so I want to follow them because I know they improve my writing. When I was a new writer, I didn't really understand writing craft to see why these rules were there and why they were a benefit to me, and so I was less likely to follow them. Now maybe I have more skill to properly break the rules, but I'm much more inclined to want to follow them because I've seen that they work. Those are some common mistakes that new writers make. Don't feel bad if you've made any of these. I mean, I made some of these really late in my writing journey. Like, I wasn't even a new writer when I made some of these mistakes. These are just all really common. If you're a new writer, we also have a video on essential tips for new writers, so if you're just getting started, you can check that out. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Let me know what the biggest mistake you made as a new writer was. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We've got new writing, editing, and publishing tips every Tuesday and Friday. Until next time.